Good morning, everyone. This is Archbishop Richard Gagnon here in Winnipeg, and this is our Friday report for November the 6th. Time is moving forward. And so we're under the zone red in the capital region of Winnipeg, and outside of that it's the orange zone in the province. And of course, it's a little bit disappointing that further restrictions are required, but everyone is cooperating and will continue to move forward. We have a liaison with the provincial government, so we are in dialogue with them to ensure that we're on the right track. And in addition to that, of course, a series of memos have gone out to the parish communities to keep them up to date on what is going on. And I very much appreciate the cooperation that has been evident throughout our community in Winnipeg. So thank you very much. And thank you very much for joining us this morning. As I said last week, I would continue and then finish today with my reflection on the Papal Encyclical Fratelli Tutti. And you might remember that 2 weeks ago I covered the first 3 chapters of this encyclical. The encyclical is on human fraternity and social friendship. Now, encyclicals are kind of like the flagship of church teaching. They contain a lot of very important material that is helpful for us in our Christian life. And in addition, they may take the form of doctrinal statements, or they could take the form of pastoral encouragement and so on. And this particular encyclical is concerned with both. It's concerned with the doctrinal teaching of the church, but heavy in the area of pastoral approach to the world around us, especially with regards to our relationships with other people. So in the first chapter, the title was Dark Clouds Over a Closed World. The Pope, as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, talked about the particular trends today that we live with, and I find that he's right on the money, so to speak. The things he describes in our world, nationally, internationally, are very, very clear and very helpful for us because we face these things all the time, either personally or through the media. And he also added the perspective of COVID-19 and how that has damaged and made fraternity, relationships with people throughout the world, decline, become fractured. The second chapter, which is typical with popes, a biblical motif was chosen. In this particular case, it was the Good Samaritan, the chapter on the Good Samaritan in the Bible, and that is used helpfully for us to look at our relationships with other people and what is our ideal, what is the Lord calling us to do, and with what figure in that parable of the Good Samaritan do we identify with. And finally, the third chapter dealt with envisioning and engendering an open world. And here, just as a review, the Pope talked about the culture of encounter and the culture of dialogue, and indeed the dignity of the human person, regardless of who we are, where we're from a rich country or a poor country, regardless of the race that we come from, we all have equal dignity and needs before the Lord. And so those 3 chapters are very helpful indeed. And also as a reminder, I mentioned historically how the particular encyclical developed, and the key thought here was the example of St. Francis of Assisi and his encounter 800 years ago with the Sultan of Egypt. And he spent a week with the Sultan during the Third Crusade, during a time of war when Christians and Muslims were at war. A culture of encounter and dialogue with the Sultan opened up doors that still exist today between Christians and Muslims in the Middle East. And so that's a major theme. And the Pope also recently, last year as a matter of fact, met with another great imam in Egypt, the imam of the Al-Azhar in Egypt, which is a prestigious seat of learning in Egypt and a mosque. And both of these men, the Pope, the Holy Father, and the Grand Imam, forged ahead with a mutual document on cooperation and social friendship throughout the world. And so it's very interesting, that connection between the time of St. Francis of Assisi and today with Pope Francis. So today we'll look at the remaining chapters very, very quickly. I don't want to make this reflection too long, so we'll make it very, very brief. Some key concepts. My purpose in this reflection is simply to inspire you to read the encyclical or perhaps certain chapters, and discuss this encyclical with others. It's very, very helpful. So in the 4th chapter, the title is A Heart Open to the World. And a key concept of this chapter is the word gratuitousness. In other words, as he says here in 139 of the encyclical, there is always the factor of gratuitousness, the ability to do some things simply because they are good in themselves, without concern for personal gain or recompense. Gratuitousness makes it possible for us to welcome the stranger, even though this brings us no immediate tangible benefit. If we're going to have fraternity and social friendship, if we're going to forge relationships with other people, we must do that because that is the right thing to do, not because of what we might get out of it, as if it was some kind of a commercial exchange. And he develops that quite thoroughly in that chapter. He also talks about the richness of the encounter with other cultures, how we are enriched by that encounter with other cultures, how others are enriched by encountering us. At the same time, he reminds us that we must be rooted in our own culture. We must know who we are, where we have come from, and what our roots are if we are truly to be welcoming people. He goes on further to say that the people that we encounter in Canada, for example, refugees or immigrants from different parts of the world, it's very important that we realize that often the countries from which they come from are countries under great difficulty and who are experiencing impoverishment. Therefore, Canada and the concert of nations around the world have a responsibility to look at that and to help countries to develop more thoroughly, because it is not the normal thing for a person to leave their family and their friends and their language and their culture and to go someplace else. A certain amount of immigration does happen, but often people leave because of the seriousness of the situation. And so he talks about that whole enrichment of meeting other cultures, the whole area of welcoming. Furthermore, in that chapter, he develops the thought of a need internationally for some kind of international rules, regulations, governing principles agreed to among nations that will somehow coordinate the movements of people. There's something like 60 or 70 million refugees at the present time in the world, and we all hear about this and through the media, we read about it in the papers. It's a very tragic situation. Each country's doing their own thing, and there's different levels of sensibilities. The Pope says this must be coordinated somehow for the sake of human dignity. And so in that chapter, he talks about those famous 4 words: welcoming, protection, promotion, and integration. To be a welcoming people to others who are in distress, to offer protection to them and to the people who live in our own country, to promote conditions so that people can thrive, and then to integrate people into our culture. I must say, when we look at the papers today, we read the media and so on, listen to the media, I find that all 4 of those words, all 4 of those concepts, welcome, protection, promotion, integration, are sadly lacking. Sometimes all 4, sometimes 2 of them. So there's a lot of work to be done. The 5th chapter is called A Better Kind of Politics. And this is interesting because he talks about politics in a very interesting way. He talks about the dangers of populism, of nationalism, and of liberalism, and the downside of those particular things. Populism, for example, people use the common feeling of the population and manipulate those feelings for other purposes. Nationalism is closely linked to that. Liberalism, individualism, submission of cultures to the agendas of special interest groups. Many things he mentions there that are quite evident in our world today. And so he says today that it's very important that we have some kind of international cooperation, some kind of international governance that will assist people who are affected by globalism, special interest groups, and the wide gap between the poor and the rich. He talks also about social love. This is interesting, social love. This is not an abstract or complex or kind of idealism. He talks about it in a very important way, and it's practical. I'll tell you why in a moment. I'll quote him. I'll quote the Holy Father in the Encyclical. He says, social love makes it possible to advance towards a civilization of love. Many popes have talked about a civilization of love, as opposed to a civilization of death. He says, to which all of us can feel called. Charity / love / agape, with its impulse to universality, is capable of building a new world. Love, charity is international. Most people in the world recognize when there is selfless giving for another person. Look at Mother Teresa and the respect that is shown her even today by her example of caritas or charity. Charity of itself has an internationalism about it that most people recognize. He says, no mere sentiment this is. It is the best means of discovering effective paths of development for everyone. Social love is a force capable of inspiring new ways of approaching the problems of the world today. An example of that is Pope Francis himself. Last year at the Vatican, the Holy Father met with 2 warring groups from South Sudan, 2 rebel leaders, opposite sides. The war in South Sudan, it has been absolutely terrible. And when the Pope met both of them in the Vatican, he asked them, he said, can I come forward to you? And they gave a funny look to the Holy Father. He walked forward, he bent down on the floor, and he kissed the feet of these 2 rebel leaders. And he said, I am asking you, as brothers, to stay in peace. I am asking you with my heart, let us go forward. There will be many problems, but they will not overcome us. Resolve your problems. A world leader like Pope Francis, a white man, bending down, kissing the feet of warring rebels, African people from the Sudan. You look at the photographs and people have their mouths open. They did not believe what they saw. But this process has begun a new cooperation in the Sudan. Charity has a wide universal appeal, social love. And then he goes on to say there's also something called political love. What is political love? He says political love is systematic governance structures that enable the poor to benefit. He says this is the spiritual heart of politics. Political love, organized charity at the political level, always aimed at the disadvantaged. And finally, in that chapter 5, he talks about tenderness, a revolution of tenderness. You see, there's many different, very interesting subjects in this encyclical that I think we can relate to on a practical level. 6th chapter, dialogue and friendship in society. We must learn about consensus building. And what does consensus building, a culture of encounter, a culture of dialogue, really mean at the practical level? And he talks about that. And one part I find interesting in that particular chapter 6 on dialogue and friendship in society is his discussion about covenant. That's a biblical concept, a covenant between indigenous people throughout the world and the governments that they are under. A way of recognizing and appreciating that there's different ways of looking at progress, different ways of looking at human relationships, and different ways of looking at the common good. Then we have chapter 7, Paths of a Renewed Encounter. And here he goes into important concepts of reconciliation and forgiveness based on truth. We must be truthful about our past. We must have a balanced view of the past, be truthful of the past and the wounds of the past, and not submit ourselves to political perspectives and agendas regarding that. Be truthful about your past, but don't let the past interfere with future progress. He quotes bishops from India. He quotes bishops from South Africa who also had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He talks about forgiveness and reconciliation in a profound way. These words are used today, especially reconciliation, quite cheaply, rather, today. And he gives us a greater understanding of these words. It's important. He says the work is continual. Doesn't just happen once. It's a lifetime project of forgiveness and reconciliation, respect for others, and based on the truth of reality. And then he ends that particular chapter with a discussion about war and the death penalty. How the idea of a just war is changing because the weapons have become so fantastically powerful that reasons for a just war are diminishing all the time. And the death penalty, it's hard to find a situation in which a death penalty sentence would be justified today. Finally, the last chapter has to do with the world religions. And he explains, and he goes into some detail, how world religions have a common denominator regarding how we have been created by the Creator, how there is a dignity to God's creation, and how world religions contain within them very important concepts that allow fraternity and social justice to develop. The problem is the interpretation of religious teachings. As we see, they become distorted, and from that comes terrorism and division. And so he talks about the important role of religion in the fraternity throughout the world between peoples and in social friendship. And his own relationship with the Grand Imam of the Alcazar in Egypt is a good example of that in their common statements together about human dignity. And so at the end of the Encyclical, both the Imam and the Holy Father have something to say about what the world needs to do. And you go through those various points, it's challenging for all of us. So that gives you a bit of a bird's eye view of what the Encyclical is all about. There's much more to it than what I've shared with you, but I would encourage you to read the Encyclical or perhaps take certain sections of it and discuss it, because it cannot help but assist us in our Christian journey. Thank you for your patience. I've enjoyed reading it myself. So today we have a number of questions that have come forth in the Archdiocese, and once again we have with us Christian Martinez, who will pose a few questions today. And I welcome you, Christian. Thank you for coming.
Okay, Your Grace, thank you once again for having me on your Friday report here. And we have
pleasure.
Thank you. And we have a number of questions here, and to our brothers and sisters in Christ, thank you so much for joining us for our Q&A. So the first question here, Your Grace, we are in the midst of the National Vocation Awareness Week. That is from November 1st to November 7th. And on our website, it says here, it is an annual week-long celebration dedicated to promoting vocations to the priesthood, religious life, and married life through prayer and education, and to renew our prayers and support for those who are discerning their vocation. Mm-hmm. So I have a question here, Your Grace, for you to begin, and just because of our Friday report, I'll leave it as an open-ended question for you. In the spirit of National Vocation Awareness Week, could you tell a little bit about your vocation journey?
Well, that's a big question there, Christian, isn't it? I'll be very, very brief. I'll give some basic principles here. I think the first thing I want to say is that when you talk about vocation, religious vocation, vocation to the priesthood, religious life, the important point here is that God actually calls people, okay? And I think it's very important for young people to realize that God calls us in many different ways, more than only religious life. He calls us throughout our lives. So God speaks to us. And so when you talk about a vocation, generally speaking, we mean to the priesthood or religious life. So it's a calling, right? And the calling of God in the hearts of men and women to enter into a life of religion and ministry is different for each person. This is what makes it very interesting, because each priest, each sister, brothers, they all have their own story, how God has called them in their own particular circumstances. And so it is with me, and I've given a more thorough talk about my vocational history before, but just a couple of basic principles. I felt a call to the priesthood when I was very, very young. I was a boy in elementary school, maybe grade 3, maybe, and I didn't really realize it, but there was a call there. I realized that, you know. But that's something I put aside for many years until I was a young adult. And as a young adult, I still had this kind of urging in that way. Now, let me distinguish here between a vocational call to religious life, the priesthood, and a career choice. Because I think in a career choice, God gives us certain talents, certain aptitudes, there are certain attractions we have to pursue a particular career. And that's kind of like a call too. But it's not the same as a call to religion. It's not the same. I know that personally because I felt that same kind of attraction to the life of teaching, and I became a teacher, right? And I experienced that. And I was very attracted to teaching, and I enjoyed teaching. But however, the call to the priesthood was a little different. It's sort of like, okay, I'm a fisherman, I'm in a boat, I'm a good fisherman, I'm enjoying this, it's steady, it's reliable. But what do you mean I'm going to be having to leave the boat and go someplace else? Do you get what I'm saying? That's the difference between the religious call and a career choice or career affinity. You know, there's a distinction. At least I noticed that distinction in my own life. And so as a young adult, I spent many years trying to distinguish that. And I think during my university years, it became fine-tuned because some of my professors in secular university in British Columbia were not really that open to religion and didn't even understand some things, and some things were said in the classroom and tutorials, which I found to be rather odd. I didn't really agree. It kind of bothered me. So it drove me into the library, basically. It drove me into the library to discover my faith myself. University can make or break you as a young adult. I spoke yesterday with young people from CCO here talking about our faith, and they told me stories of their own life, very, very similar. You know, so I found the university years to be very instrumental for that reason. I also spent a number of years traveling at different times. I travel on my own, and I learned to listen to God, to spend quiet time with the Lord. I visited particular shrines in Europe and so on. All that had a tremendous influence on me and eventually led to my understanding that God is actually calling me to the priesthood, even though I was successful as a teacher and doing very well in that particular area. And I looked also at my involvement in service towards others, teaching catechism, for example, involvement with the poor in the downtown area in Vancouver. All of this came together to help me realize that God was calling me to the priesthood. These were signposts along the way. There's much more I can say about that, but I think that gives you a particular sort of flavor of it. And my particular journey really was distinct in my experiences, similarities with some others. But when I talk to other priests and bishops and so on, they all have interesting stories. And I think what I'd like younger people to realize is that God speaks to us. Some of us are called to religious life of service in the ministry. But God speaks to us in whatever we do. What is God's plan for me and my life, right? That's the question to ask. And not always try to use money or power influence as my signpost in making a decision. What does God want me to do? What am I made for? So that's a whole perspective. So that's how I would approach that question. This is the week for praying for vocations, vocation awareness. So I think it's a good week to reflect on that.
Sure, Your Grace. I'm going to ask one follow-up question,
Sure.
and resisting the urge to ask many, many more because there's so much here, and maybe as a teaser for our brothers and sisters in Christ, we can do an entire episode just on this, but I'll just do one follow-up question, Your Grace. So for our young people nowadays, with the gift of technology, of course, there's no shortage of information. They can get all of this information online. But there's something different about really being prayerful and discerning about one's vocation. So what advice would you give a young person to really think about or pray or discern their vocation nowadays?
Okay. I think I answered that question, Christian, when I said that as a young adult, I traveled quite a bit, you know, when I was working, but my spare times when I could travel. And I traveled on my own. because you learn a lot about life. When you're traveling with other people, you rely and you're worried about pleasing other people. As a young person, you have this flexibility. And that's a beautiful flexibility because you learn about life, you learn about yourself, you have time to listen within your heart and also to observe other people and to observe the world around you. Social media, like TV and all the things, are very engrossing, and we can lose ourselves in that. Who are you? What are you? What are you made for? This is the great adventure that I think young people need to embark upon. So find times of silence, find times to be alone, find time to know who you are and what God is saying to you. I think that's at the bottom of your question.
Sure. For our young people, when you speak of a traveler's heart or a pilgrim's heart, let's say, that doesn't necessarily mean traveling overseas and going on this wonderful journey, but just having that openness and solitude and the boldness to ask these questions, right?
Exactly.
So, okay. So, Your Grace, we'll move on. We have a few more questions here. So, the next question is, do you know how the parish priests and pastoral ministers are handling the constant changes in COVID-19 restrictions?
You're right about the constant changes. I mean, the landscape is changing constantly, right? It's almost like wartime where the situation is changing, the front is changing here, changing there, and so on. I find that there's one word that would describe our pastors, I think. Well, more than one word would describe our pastors. They're all different individuals. I would say determined. They're determined to do this. So I get questions. Okay, what about this? What about this? The guidelines in the province say this and this. How am I going to do that? You sort of get what I'm saying? How am I going to do that? I'm determined to do this. I'm determined to make it work. Because the pastors are leaders of their faith communities and they want to make it work. There's lots of questions, there's lots of problems and disappointments, but I would say that they're determined. I would say that they are positive, and they rely a lot on the support of their people. And their job is also to support their people, affirm their people. So that's how I would approach that question. So I'm very pleased with that. I'm impressed with it, and it's edifying to see.
Absolutely. I experienced that to a much lesser extent than you, Your Grace, but sometimes if one of our pastors or administrators would call me, I'd be struck by their humility and, like you say, the determination to see this through along with the community.
Exactly. Exactly.
So, Your Grace, we have another question here, and it says, I am a little bit confused about the concept of cohorts. Could you tell us how it works?
I'll do that, Christian. It's a word we're not familiar with too much. It's a word that goes back to ancient times. The Roman army, they functioned in cohorts, which are groups, blocks of men, blocks of soldiers here, blocks of soldiers there. So under the guidelines and protocols of the pandemic that we're under, when we talk about funerals and weddings, we talk about possible cohorts of 5 people each. Now, for funerals and weddings, the first thing to remember that the numbers of people that are allowed does not include the celebrant, that's separate, and the funeral home directors, and even the cantor. What we're talking about is 5 people of the family. So in the city of Winnipeg, under the red zone, we are allowed total number of 15% of the capacity of the church altogether, okay? Or 100 people, whatever is less. So at a funeral or a wedding, you could have possibly up to 15% and up to 30% respectively, groups of 5 people. That's your cohort. 5 people here, 5 people there, 5 people there, etc. Providing you keep within those percentages for the church. And the groups of people, the cohorts themselves, are not intermingling. That's the point. The normal social distance must be there. Sanitizing must be there. But the cohorts, they enter the church separately, they leave separately. Therefore, you'll need the assistance of ushers, possibly the funeral home directors. So in the city of Winnipeg then, up to 15% of the capacity of the church, or 100 people, whatever is less. For funerals, you can have cohorts up to that number. In the countryside, it's up to 30%, cohorts of 5 people. That's what we mean, Christian, by cohorts.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that it's not a commonly used word, but that is used today to describe that particular technique of approaching funerals and weddings. I know it's quite restrictive, but I think it allows a little bit more flexibility when it comes to families that are involved in funerals or weddings. Okay?
Thank you for the clarification,
You're most
Your
welcome.
Grace. And I would just like to point out that in terms of the parts of the province under Code Orange,
Yeah.
and the restrictions of up to 30% of capacity or 250 people, whichever is lower,
250.
this is a recent change.
Yeah.
So I think we can announce that we had previously announced 20% in our memo.
Yeah.
However, we received communication from the provincial government just earlier this week that they made a last-minute decision to change that restriction to 30%. So just to be very clear about that, there is a change, but that's the reason for the change is we received updated information about
Thank
this.
you, Christian. And Christian is closely associated with communications on this issue. And you're quite right, in the rural area, it's up to 250 people, or 30%, whatever is less, right? And the city of Winnipeg, it's 15 or 100 in that respect. So it's new, it's a change. And so there'll be a memo going out about that to the parishes.
Yes, of course, Your
Okay,
Grace.
thank you. Thank you for the question.
Of course. Okay, Your Grace, so we come to the final question for this week. And it is a question from Instagram. It's an interesting wording here. Is there anything you miss about the old normal?
The old normal, I'm forgetting what the old normal is. I'm not too sure that we were ever normal, the old normal, right? I mean, times change all the time. So, but I know what the question is asking about, right? What do I miss about that? Well, I'll tell you what I miss. I miss the personal contact, and I miss the freedom. And that's not just me. That's every one of us, in this situation. Those two things I miss a lot. And it's a great pleasure. Whenever it's possible, I will have an in-person meeting, given the guidelines and all that sort of thing. But because it's such a pleasure, because we do so much over the internet now. Now, having said that, what is the encouragement in this situation? Well, a year ago or so, when I was in the Middle East, and I lived and moved within the Christian communities, including Gaza, and I saw with my own eyes what it's like as Christians, small in number, to live restricted lives in those situations. They do so. They are flourishing, and they do a lot of good for others. They move within restrictions. Go around the world, and you will see in many places where Christians are persecuted, sometimes very severely, the church continues. So yes, we have restrictions, but we're not living under a persecution. We're not stuck behind the walls in Gaza. So I think it's good to put things in perspective. The restrictions that we have are based on the need to mitigate the virus, but also to respect our neighbors. So looking at it that way, we miss personal contact, and we miss the freedom, but we still live and move forward in our faith. The church continues to exist, and so it does in the Archdiocese of Winnipeg. That's how I would approach that question.
Sounds good. Thank you, Your Grace. Those are our questions for this week.
Thank you very much, Christian. Well, there you have our Friday report for November the 6th. Thank you once again for joining us. It's always a pleasure for me to speak with you and also to receive your comments and questions. It's a way during these days of the pandemic to communicate with one another, and I think that's a very important thing. So, May the Lord be with you and your families. May God protect you and keep you safe. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.